Welcome to Who We Remember. I'm Jamie Yuenger, the founder of StoryKeep, and your host for this podcast. In each episode, I ask my guest a central question. Whose life story from your own family would you most want to see documented on film? My guests share stories of both living and deceased family members, revealing the remarkable lives that have shaped their own. This show is an extension of our mission at StoryKeep, where we partner with prominent families across the globe to preserve their histories through legacy films and private podcasts. Since 2010, we've worked with over 100 families, helping them capture their narratives for future generations. On this podcast, I share intimate conversations with family members and advisors and explore the significant and sometimes very surprising stories of their loved ones. Through these conversations, we elevate and celebrate the enduring influence of one person's life. My hope is that you'll leave each episode inspired to think more deeply about your own life and the legacy that you want to create. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Patricia Angus. Patricia is one of the foundational figures in the world of family enterprise consulting. Today, she'll be sharing the incredible life story of her great-grandfather, Francisco Escobar. Patricia learned of her great-grandfather's life through her maternal grandmother, who told her many stories about his adventures and great works. Francisco was born in Colombia, and as a young man, he moved on his own to New York City. He attended Columbia, worked as an engineer, and then later, on behalf of Colombia, he helped get reparations from the U.S. government. He was a lover and writer of poetry, some of which you'll hear in this episode. Before I fully step into Francisco's story, let me introduce you to his great-granddaughter, my guest, Patricia Angus. Patricia is the CEO of the consulting firm Angus Advisory Group. She is a globally recognized family enterprise educator and advisor. She teaches at Columbia Business School and University of Chicago. She founded Columbia's Global Family Enterprise Program and has written numerous articles and 2 books covering topics including estate planning, trusts, family wealth, and the social contract. And get this, as a kid, Patricia wrote a love story about her 3rd grade teacher for her school's book contest. So it's clear that she has been a hound for stories and writing for a very long time. Please grab a seat and spend some time with Patricia to hear some of the incredible stories of her great-grandfather, Francisco Escobar. So, Patricia, it's such a delight to sit down and spend time with you today, speaking about your great-grandfather, who, assumedly, you haven't had the chance to meet personally.
We did not meet personally. No, unfortunately.
So tell me why it is that so we sat down, and of course, prior to this, we talked about the concept of the show, and I said, well, who from your own family would you most want to have documented this person's family's, his life story on film? And I believe in that conversation, you did think of your great-grandfather as a first sort of person. So tell me why he sprung to mind.
I think it came immediately to mind, and I would say probably for myself and most of my family, he's the most interesting character. Not that we're not all interesting, and we all have our lives that are meaningful and purposeful, but he led such a varied life, and I learned so much about him from my grandmother. And this was my mother's mother, so my maternal grandmother, who was really the only grandparent I ever knew. I had another grandmother who died when I was quite young, but the grandmother that I knew well, I think she died when I was in my 20s. So she was a great storyteller, a raconteur, and there were awesome stories about this great-grandfather, Francisco Escobar.
Francisco Escobar.
Tell me more about. Yes.
What a name, first of all.
Yes. No relation to Pablo Escobar. Okay, let's just get that clear. Right.
Okay. And your grandmother, your maternal grandmother, what was her name, by the way?
Francisca.
Of course.
Yeah, she was one of 4 daughters of Francisco and Florence, who were an amazing couple in the early 1900s.
So this is her father, and she is telling you stories about him. So what are some of the most vivid stories that she shared with you?
Well, we can start at the beginning. And I have to say, when, you're American, you're growing up in the U.S. and you're going to school and everybody's talking about Ellis Island and these immigrants who came through. And, I grew up outside New York City, and many of my school peers had relatives who came through there. And my grandmother was insistent that that was not our story. And I didn't quite know what that meant at the time. And looking back, I understand a little better. So Francisco, in his teens, was one of 11 children in Medellin, Colombia. And he got on a ship and came to New York City and came to Columbia Grammar and Prep School, which still exists, which is cool. So he didn't just come for college, he came for high school. And then he went on.
What year about did you say this is? Patricia, about
the late 1880s, early 1890s, I would say.
Okay.
Right? And so from there, he went to Columbia College of Mines, which was Columbia University precursor, name-wise. It wasn't up on the regular campus now, but he became an engineer. And so he was a smart, adventurous, courageous young man who got himself to New York and went to, one of the best universities in the world at the time. And, the reason I'm here and the reason that the cousins who I was with this weekend, which we can talk about, are here, is that he was, he met one or two of his classmates whose last name was Joplin. And he got invited to go out to their home in Ohio for a holiday. I always think it's Thanksgiving, so it's sort of fun we're doing this right before Thanksgiving. So little Francisco goes out to Cleveland, Ohio, with his friend, Thomas or Reginald Joplin, I don't know which one, and he meets Florence. And that's the rest of the story. So Francisco marries Florence, and then they live in New York, and he has this amazing life after that. I have a stack of stuff here that my mom's cousin, my aunt, gave me right before she died. And there's some great newspaper articles, not just about him, but also about Florence. So on their wedding trip, they go back to Colombia, but they get shipwrecked in Aruba. And the article says, okay, the ship is stuck and everybody's freaking out and they're all throwing on their, life jackets. What are they going to do? And the whole point of the article is that Florence entertains everybody singing, and she won't even put on a life jacket because she's like, I'm going to be fine. We're all okay. So there's something about not just Francisco, but he chooses Florence, who was this strong British woman whose family had come over from England. And so the combination of the sort of Spanish from Colombia plus the English from Ohio, and both of them had this amazing spirit that's where the rest of us sort of came from in a way.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And I think you shared with me that he wrote poetry. Was that when he was young and also older, or how did the poetry make sense?
I still have a lot of work to do on this. And I was reading, he has this Epic of America, which I just found the original and the translation this morning. So poetry was just sort of a sidebar for him. So here it is. He wrote that in 1922. So he was not young by then. Yeah. This was the original version of it I think he wrote it in Spanish, but it's also translated into English.
Can you read us a few lines?
If I can find the English translation, give me a second. Here we are. I've got an English translation that my uncle, I call them uncle and aunt. They were, cousins of my mom, sent to my aunt. That family's daughter, who's my second cousin, I was at the wedding of her daughter this weekend, and sitting next to my second cousin, who looks a lot like Francisco. So the picture that I sent you, I'm sitting next to him thinking, oh my God, I'm next to Francisco. But let's see, you want a few lines? I'm trying to think. It's really the whole history of the founding of the Americas. The Greek philosophers have lit the minds of geographers. Already they investigate a new continent and the remains of lost Atlantis. The one that, wounded by Jupiter, with its enormous wealth, was swallowed by the sea, dwelling place of an arrogant people, whose vices cost them their lives. That's the one the seafarer searches for, challenging the menacing seas with the invincible strength of an idea. On his lips he has a pious prayer, in his hand the cross and the astrolabe, and with them he completes the world. So that's just the beginning of the epic of... But that was only one minor thing that this man did, write poetry.
Right. So what are the big pillars of his life story that you would want to have documented in a film?
Sure. A film about him would be very interesting. So they go back to Colombia for their honeymoon and decide to come back to New York. Mm-hmm. And by the late 1800s, the early 1900s, he becomes Consul General from Colombia to New York. So he's basically representing the interests of the Colombian business world. He's an engineer, so he has a private sector job and he has a public sector vocation and job as well. And in addition, arts and literature. So I'd say the pillars were really, engineering business, definitely a businessman, plus representing his country, plus having an arts and letters, what we would have called a man of letters, kind of, right? Mm-hmm. The most interesting part about his being Consul General is, if you know your history, in the early 1900s, a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, who I was raised to hate, who everyone in my classes was taught to love, had arranged for gunboats to be put outside of the country of Colombia around the time that they got to know the Panamanian sort of isthmus and fostered a revolution, and basically within a day or very short period of time stole Panama from Colombia. So when you think of the Panama Canal, basically that was a plot of land that was part of Colombia that the U.S. took. This was the family lore, and I'm in class and I was like, Teddy Roosevelt's great. I'm like, no, he's not. So Francisco Escobar, as Consul General, spent a lot of time trying to get reparations for Colombia. I've got lots of articles in the New York Times, letters that he wrote to Teddy Roosevelt and that were written back, sort of saying, you took the isthmus. And he wrote a book about that as well, like in his spare time. I don't know how he did all this. So basically, he fought on behalf of his home country that he came from against the country that became his home, saying, this was unfair. We need to do something about it. And I respect that a lot. I think it's really, says a lot about a person to have done that, to stick to his convictions,
Truly.
Until, 1979, under Jimmy Carter, we finally resolved Panama. But that was sort of part of the family lore. But what's interesting is, people tell family stories. Usually they don't have something that involves countries and right, and the formation of countries and revolutions. And my grandmother was just this amazingly smart person who could tell us all these stories about her father, fighting for a cause, which was really interesting,
And what about his world as an engineer? What do you know of that? His life?
I don't know as much. I wish I knew more about that. I know that the Joplin side, which would have been my grandmother's, uncles, were engineers as well. One of the uncles ended up running Otis, so every time I'm in an elevator, and it was before there were elevators, so he was the president of Otis, whatever the company was called then. But I think it had a lot to do with Colombia and the mining and the resources they had down there. That was part of the origins of his interest in it, but it was also, sort of career-wise, he was as much representing the industry as sort of applying it as an engineer.
Applied. So one of the interesting things when we think about family members that are kind of long ago and multiple generations back is like they become these larger-than-life characters, which in a sense they are, but then they also are just people who had to put their pants on, one leg at a time. And I'm curious, when you think about the opportunity, this real man who was flesh and bone, to be able to capture him in film, either doing interviews and or just real scenes of him going about his day. What would you be most curious to truly ask him?
What got him on the boat? There's 11 kids in the family. Why did he get on the boat? And, I think that's that is the classic American immigrant story, which is, why did you leave a place that in his case was pretty comfortable from what I understand? And what was that spark of interest and curiosity and adventure that led him to do something that, 99% of people would not have done? So I would love to know that. I would love to know what it was like to be in New York in the early 1900s. When the first time I saw Riverside Drive, because I ended up going to Colombia too, so the school. So he graduates in 1898. And then my mom's cousin goes to Columbia College, probably like 1950s-ish, 40s, 50s, something like that. I end up there in the 80s, just sort of because. And the first time I saw Riverside Drive, I thought, I have to live here. I need to live here. And then I talked to my grandmother about it. And she says, well, that's where I was born in 1900. So they were living on Riverside Drive. I ended up finally living there in around 2003 or so. 2006, I think. So there was some thread of the choices he was making that were then impacting the choices I was making. And so I'm really curious, what were the challenges he had at the time? What was it like to go out to Ohio, to this probably pretty stuffy English household, and, be from a completely different culture? And what was that all about? One thing though, yes, I would love to have the opportunity to interview him. I'd love to have the opportunity to see him live in video, but he left a lot of writing. And so I've got this, back right here, and this is what I got from my mom's cousin. Not just articles about him, but his writings. And another story in, I don't know, about 5 years ago, I went from London up to the town where I knew my grandmother's family had come from in England. Mm-hmm. And somehow just before it, one of my family members said, you have to get a copy of his diary before you go. Okay, fine. So I got a copy of his diary. And literally, I'm in a car with my friend driving over these hills, going to Chatsworth, which is this famous, whatever we call it, castle in England. And I'm reading his words from I forget what it was, 1909, 1910, about his trek across those same hills on horseback, going to visit this place that I was going. So yes, I would like to meet him and say, what was that experience like? But I have his writings. So that, I think, is something, when I think about the fact that I work with families for a career, document things and keep some record so people in the future can read your words in your own language, in your own words. And what's interesting with him is we have some in Spanish and some in English. Some he wrote in English and some he wrote in Spanish. And so it's more accessible to me in English, but it's also nice that he was still writing in his own language.
Yeah. Well, I think if
why did he not go back? Why didn't they go back to Colombia? Why'd they stay here?
Right?
Who knows? Yeah.
All these decisions that it's hard to get the answers to.
Yeah.
Well, as you were telling this beautiful tale of you taking this trip in a car, I guess, and him on horseback, I would make the film where you were reading his words on the trip, and then sort of cutting back and forth, some kind of playful reenactment of that would be really something to hear his words. I think having people's diaries and letters, we have worked with those quite a bit in the past, and my beautiful vision, which has yet to happen yet, I'm looking forward to this, is family members reading their older family members' words, right? Being the narrator, because I think that that's such a beautiful thing, and I'm sure you would do a beautiful job at something like that. So
to hear their words, your voice, because you've got the genes in you too. There's some connection there. Just is.
Yeah. Yeah. And does the Colombian heritage trickle down through into your family and into your life, Patricia?
Well, watch out when we get mad. But that was always a joke. Yeah. And my grandmother also insisted that it was really Spanish. I don't know how long they had been in Colombia. I think it was like maybe a generation there before he came here. So they had really come from Spain originally, which was interesting too. I don't know whether the heritage, I have to say, when I got off the plane in Madrid for the first time, I felt like I was looking at relatives. It was really strange. Yesterday, sitting at the table Saturday next to my second cousin, and we have a picture now of 3 second cousins and me. We've got something the same, the Spanish eyes somehow that, I just literally Googled before we got on, and you only get 3.125% of the same DNA as your second cousins. But I could see it, so yes, nothing about the Spanish heritage. Yeah. And frankly, I think it's partly because, I'm a big believer, tell your children their stories, tell your grandchildren the stories of your grandparents, because I wouldn't care as much if I hadn't sat with my grandmother so many hours hearing these stories. It wouldn't be the same to just watch it in the future. So I think I heard so much about Spanish and the English. My dad's side I didn't hear as much about. And I wish, because that grandmother I didn't know, and that grandfather I never would have known. And so, my oldest cousin on that side, I pump her with questions all the time, but it's not the same as having had sitting down together, So I feel more Spanish and English than whatever my dad's side was, which is also English and Scottish and, all that. It's not the same because I didn't hear the stories from them,
Right. So with your grandmother, what kind of scene would you find yourself in when she would be telling you the stories? Like, how did you hang out with her?
Well, it was sort of fun because she moved after my grandfather died to be near us. My mom had 5 kids she was trying to raise. So my grandmother was, coming over and helping. And she was just such a fun, interesting, smart person. She spent the end of her life reading 3 books at a time, because one wasn't enough. Often I would go to her apartment, and that was sort of fun because I lived in a house and I was like, wow, an apartment is cool. And a lot of her stuff was around her from her family. And I have some of that. Just at my second cousin's yesterday, I saw the same prints of our great-great-grandparents' home in Ohio on her wall that I have, as well. And I've got stuff from that. But no, I would just hang out with my grandmother, just the 2 of us. And then at holidays or family gatherings or just after dinner, you just hear the stories,
Yeah.
It was a naturally occurring thing. It wasn't something that you had to contrive by any means.
And when you're looking now and sort of reflecting on how your life has played out up to this point and also the profession you've chose of advising families, how does his legacy, and maybe also your grandmother, it sounds like, how do they infuse and play into how you see yourself and how you conduct yourself?
I wish I could live a life that was as impactful, if that's a word, and meaningful as he lived. That was always my aspiration. This person I never knew was what I aspired to be, which is interesting. I always, not always, from about age 10 or 11 on, I wanted to be an international lawyer. And I did become one, and then moved on to, family work on a global level. I think his story was inspired me, that working on an international level. That was also for my dad too, because my dad was traveling internationally. And so I was always intrigued by where he was working. But I think a lot of it had to do with this, this person who did stuff not just internationally, but had a public element to him. I got a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. That was not chance, I don't think. It was about, 100, literally, probably exactly 101 years after he graduated, I graduated, focusing on international affairs. So it wasn't chance, really, than that, I thought I would go into public policy. I found families so interesting and fascinating and much more one-on-one for me. So the idea of being in the government or writing, white papers is something I chose not to do, because for me, I want to help people one-on-one. So he was trying to help a country. I try to help individuals who have a lot of impact in what they do. So you have to sort of tweak it to yourself, but it was definitely the inspiration, like no doubt on it.
Well, maybe the other side of your family that you don't know a lot about was the other influence. You never know.
Oh, yes, a lot of that too. Yeah, for sure.
But what I can say is I think your great-grandmother who was singing and when the boat was going down, I can kind of see you doing that, Patricia. So,
no, I don't have the voice. Apparently she had a beautiful voice, but
you have the voice of nature, though. I think you do.
The line of strong women as well. And so the fact that he chose a strong woman, I think, is really important as well. I remember reading about John D. Rockefeller, and, in my field, you sort of read these biographies of these famous families. And I think the most important thing about, in my opinion, my humble opinion, John Rockefeller Sr., his wife, her high school speech that she did because she was valedictorian or something, was, "I can paddle my own canoe." So there's something about that choice that Rockefeller made that is sort of like, the choice that was made here. If you choose two strong people.
Well, I do remember when we were first speaking that your great-grandfather was the first came to mind as who you would want to speak about, but then you had some doubts because you felt like women's stories and women's voices, if I'm remembering correctly, should have more playtime. And so, but I can see how the two of them, and also because of his particular life story and history, that you had to choose him.
Well, now you understand. Well, he's certainly the most interesting in terms of a public sense, but she's pretty interesting too. And no family is made just by one person, certainly not one man. And so I do think, I'm pretty sure we talked about this in the field that I've chosen, which is working with families with multi-generational wealth, trusts, foundations. It's never just one person. And I think that's something that we all have to keep remembering, that a family is, sort of not just, it starts with two people, but it's a lot bigger than that. And I wouldn't have known about him without my grandmother, and I wouldn't have the same connection with my second cousins if we all hadn't heard those stories too, and the stories of the whole family, really. If I can think about a regret, we don't know the Colombian side of the family, and I did, always wonder, but geopolitics get in the way. In the, say, 60s, 70s, and 80s, when we were all growing up, it was a dangerous place. And so we were not going to travel down to Colombia in that era. Now it's a completely different story, but you wonder if that had gone differently, whether we would have stayed connected,
Right.
And that's something in our field, if you're working with families, there's often the story of people leaving because of revolution, or, I've had families who've had property expropriated by the government, and the role of government in our lives is something that gets forgotten when people talk about family business. But, we can't not think about the social contract and how it all fits together. I would love to talk to him about the social contract, about what's going on in our world right now. What would he think about it?
Well, so, there's so many questions we have, right, for especially people who we didn't meet, but maybe also equally for people who we did meet from our families. But as a final question to you is, what would you want to tell him, not ask him, but what would you want to tell him if you had the chance to sit next to him? And
I want to say thank you. Thank you for setting an example. Thank you for caring about the world beyond yourself. Thank you for the courage that you had to come. My nephew was recently on Colombia's campus, and I said, well, it's a family heritage back to 1890s, and he didn't know the story. And I said, he went off to be on a holiday to Ohio, and my nephew said, wow, those little decisions. He went there for whatever it was, Christmas, Thanksgiving. Those little decisions, maybe a little bit more about the decisions, but I want to say thank you. I'd want him to be here to help us now. I think we need more people who care about the world, not just as a public figure, but in a family and also with arts and literature too. This is probably just as important as the, fighting for the reparations was. Poetry needs to be a part of it as well.
I can't think of a better way to end than on the value of poetry. Just thank you so much for sharing your great-grandfather with me and with all the listeners.
Sure. Well, thank you, and keep doing your good work. Look forward to hearing and seeing more of these interviews that you're doing. It's great stuff.
Yeah.